What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. We are going to start our series on the overhead panel and oral prep videos and things like that. I'm going to break it into 6 sections. 5 of them are going to be overhead panel, and then this first one is going to be just kind of an overview of what to expect that I've seen, not necessarily what's going to happen at your airline, but to get you as best prepared for an oral for a 767 type rating as I can get you. Now, again, none of this is a part of a training program. This is all just me, who is a ground instructor for a 7.6, going over information that is, in my opinion, useful to know, first off, and second, will help you get through your type rating oral with ease. Okay? So, just a little bit of a background for me. I've done, I don't know, something around 3 to 450 students, roughly, as far as getting them prepared for the 767 type rating. Haven't had one fail yet. Knocking on as much wood as I can find there. Haven't had one person fail their oral yet. I've had some people, obviously, that didn't do so well later in training, but sometimes you just can't teach stick and rudder skills. You either have them or you don't. But this first video, we're going to talk about the beginning portion of it, what you have to do before you actually get into the overhead panel and talking about the actual systems. Now, again, I'm going to break this into 6 different videos. So it's going to be a series that's going to be here on the channel. And then there's going to be one long video at the end of it that'll have all this information in it in one video, if you would rather sit and listen to me drone for that long. Okay? All right, so let's get started. So what normally happens for a type rating? If you've had a type rating before, you kind of understand the way that it goes. If you've never had a type rating, this will all be new information to you. Basically, you start off, you come in, you introduce yourself to the FAA or to the APD, the Aircrew Program Designee for the FAA, who could be a employee of your company. Could be somebody filling in for the FAA, something like that. Introduce yourself, you sit, you talk for a minute, and then you get into, discussing about memory items and limitations and things like that. Now, I'm not covering memory items because, for one, they're different at every airline. Boeing puts out a list and says these are what we suggest you have as your memory items, and then airlines can kind of adjust and get approved for different things. So, one airline might have 5, another airline might have 8, depending on the airplane you've come from. Hell, there might be 40, depending on, what you had before. The 7.6 is pretty generic when it comes to it. It's usually between 5 and 8. And then how many steps that are in those memory items are based on the airline. Whether or not you have a quick action card in the cockpit will depend on your airline. It's all dependent on where you are. So that's why I don't feel comfortable covering memory items. There are a couple of memory items that are pretty much universal. That's going to be like aborted engine start and like rapid depressurization or rapid decompression, however they want to say it. But still, the steps could be a little bit different, and I don't want to confuse anybody. Limitations is kind of the same way, though. So, limitations, some airplanes or some airlines will make you memorize all the weights to the airplanes. And this airplane weighs this much, this airplane weighs this much. And that can be really daunting depending on your fleet. One of the companies I work for, or do work for, they have kilogram airplanes and they have pound airplanes. Well, that would mean now you've got to memorize the kilogram weights and you got to memorize the pound weights. That can be kind of a pain. Some airlines might make you memorize flap speeds, where other airlines won't because they're placarded inside the aircraft. So again, that's all going to be dependent on your particular airline. However, there are some limitations that are universal to all 767s. And that's what I'm going to kind of show you here as we go through this. Now, obviously, this is a flight crew operations manual out of X-Plane. It is the most generic FCOM that you will ever find. But it works for this purpose because it has the basic limitations listed in it. Obviously, again, depending on what you're qualified for, what your airline is certified to do, maybe you have some additional limitations. Depending on where you bought your airplanes from, maybe you've got some additional limitations for those. So please, 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 always make sure that you know your limitations and your memory items before going into your oral. Okay? Some of the generic ones that are going to be the same for all 767s are going to be things like runway slope. That's not going to change based on aircraft. That's the same for all 767s. And it's plus or minus 2%. Okay, and we're talking about the slope of the runway plus or minus 2%. And then we have maximum operating altitude, 43.1. That's the same for all 767s. And that's pressure altitude. And then we have our maximum takeoff and landing altitude. Now, I say that this is a static limitation, but it is, but it isn't. And I'll preface it with it. That's going to depend on your airplane, because they all have a base limitation of 8,400 feet. But if you're on an airplane that has a high altitude switch, where you can just push a button and it changes all your stuff to high altitudes, or to be able to fly into high altitudes and that kind of thing, that number is going to be a little bit different. So the base number for all 7.6s is 8,400 feet. Pressure altitude is your maximum for takeoff and landing. But if you have a high altitude switch, generally it changes it to about 14,000, 14.1, something like that. It all, again, it's aircraft dependent. And what that does is that changes the way your aircraft reacts to certain things, to certain cabin altitudes, to certain when your oxygen drops in the back, it changes that. So I mean, there are some little nuances to it, but the basic number is 8,400 feet. Same thing with the maximum takeoff and landing tailwind. Now, some airlines have a mixed fleet. They have some 7.6s that have a 10 knot tailwind limit, and they have other 7.6s that have a 15 knot tailwind limit. A lot of them will just take it and they will say, nope, we're going to do everything at 10 knots, and they'll be done. They won't do it anymore. They'll just say 10 knots for everything. And that's the most conservative, right? Because a 15 knot tailwind is kind of ridiculous to try and land on. If you have the opportunity to move to a different runway, why wouldn't you just do that? So 10 knots, that's going to be your basic number, and then aircraft dependent, it could go up to 15. Then looking here, we've got turbulent penetration speed. This is severe turbulent penetration speed. It's 290 indicated, or 0.78 Mach, whichever is lower. That's a generic throughout the entire fleet of 7.6s. And same thing with the navigation displays, don't support anything greater than 87 degrees north or south. That is a norm in 7.6 limitations. Same thing as don't you operate HFs during refueling operations. Okay, we can kind of figure out why, right? We don't want to have high frequency radios going over where it could be fuel fumes. It could cause a static charge and then cause a fire, and then fire fuel airplanes never works out well. Some of these other things, we've got some RVSM stuff. I'm not going to worry about it so much because everybody's RVSM. This is your maximum differences between your altimeters. This is a big one. Weather radar. Do not operate the weather radar in a hangar or within 50 feet of any personnel or a fuel spill. Okay. Obviously, it doesn't apply to the test. It doesn't apply to the test because the test doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't send anything out. It doesn't send out any kind of radar. If you were to operate within a hangar or within 50 feet of any personnel or a fuel spill, again, within the fuel spill thing, we're talking about setting a fire. Personnel, we're talking about, I don't know, causing damage to them. That's being around radar. It isn't necessarily the best thing for our bodies. So we want to try and eliminate that. Takeoff weights, these are going to vary depending on the airplane. This is the normal, like this is what the aircraft was certified to. It was 413,000 pounds for a taxi weight, 412 for a maximum takeoff. And then the other two are going to be their landing weight and zero fuel weight, fine, but they vary based on airplane restrictions on whatever your aircraft might have. Yeah, see here, they also may be further restricted by field length, climb, brake energy, all that kind of stuff too. All of that will be dependent on what you're doing in your takeoff analysis and all that kind of stuff, so we're not going to worry about that. Auto flight, you do have some limitations when it comes to that. You got headwind, crosswind, tailwind for Cat 1. So Category 1 auto lands is 25 knots headwind, 25 knots crosswind, 10 knots of tailwind. For Cat 2 and 3, it then turns into 25 headwind, 15 crosswind, and then 10 tailwind. And again, some airlines may operate with that 15 knot tailwind. It's just going to depend. After takeoff, autopilot must not be engaged below 200 feet. Okay? We don't want the autopilot engaged below 200 feet. We want to make sure that we're above the ground before we turn it on. Use of aileron trim with the autopilot engaged is prohibited. This is because when we talk about aileron trim, the airplane will correct for it if you add in aileron trim with the autopilot on. And it'll correct, and you'll never see how much aileron trim you actually have in until you either turn off the autopilot or the autopilot gives up and gives the airplane back to you. And in that case, you're looking at, your yoke all of a sudden going to wherever that aileron trim was, and that might put you in a bad situation. Engines. Biggest thing here is not blanking the engine vibration during display during takeoff. I haven't done a video on this yet, but when we talk about the ICAS, the engine vibrations is the one that doesn't have an automatic call-up feature to it, so you have to have it displayed during takeoff. And then fuel tank temperatures, you got 3 degrees above the freezing point of the fuel being used, or 49 degrees C. Those are your two limitations as far as your cold and your hot. Hopefully your airline puts in a chart that tells you what the freezing point of the fuel being used is. That way you can remember it. Reverse thrust, you can only use it on the ground. You can't use it to back up the airplane. I always like to make the point that it's prohibited. Okay? Prohibited, not inhibited. So what that means is could you back the airplane up? Absolutely. You can do anything you want on your last day, because that's what it's going to be. Because you're going to shell out the engine by the time you even get it moved. You're going to blow so much stuff out in front of it and suck it right back in that it's going to thaw out the engine. So let's not do that. Okay. Flight controls, maximum altitude for flap extension is 20,000 feet. Why 20,000 feet? Well, that's the highest altitude Boeing tested it. So why would you need to put the flaps down higher than that? I don't know. Maybe there's a reason. But 20,000 feet is your maximum altitude for flap extension. And then, of course, there's always this one. Avoid rapid and large alternating control inputs, especially in combination with large changes of pitch, roll, or yaw, as they may result in structural failure at any airspeed, including below VA. Now, that gets put in there because of the American Airlines accident that happened right after 9/11. I believe it was in like December or something of 2001. There was an Airbus that got into wake turbulence, and the way they tried to get out of the wake turbulence was to basically dance on the rudder. It wasn't really dancing, though. It was full left, full right, full left, or vice versa. It was full 3 directions, and it broke the tail off the back of the airplane, and the airplane ended up crashing in New York. So that's why we have that one in there. And then we've got not supposed to use the terrain display for navigation. You shouldn't be at low anyway, but we're not trying to shoot the gap with our terrain display to be able to navigate with. So that's just a quick rundown of some of the limitations that are going to be the same for pretty much any 7.6 that you get into. As I've said before, check your company manuals. Make sure that your company manuals, or that you are familiar with your company manuals and all the limitations that are located in that book. Okay. Most of the time, companies will do things like put a hashtag next to them, or they'll turn them red, or they'll do something to the limitation to tell the crew member that that is a memory item limitation. That is a limitation you should have in your head and you should be able to repeat without having to look it up. So those I would pay special attention to. But outside of that, being familiar with the rest of them is always a good idea because it's a good reference to come back to. Now that we've completed this portion of it, once you get done with this portion of the oral, normally what happens is you move right into the overhead panel and you start getting berated with questions on the overhead panel. So let's go ahead and go over to there and start talking about some systems.